Hello. This week we are talking about the Cold War, and I want to give you a brief overview. Please make sure that you rewatch the second half of the video that I posted in Module 6, which has the overview from Module 6 through 10, which deals with the Cold War and links the different subjects, the Second World War and the For Freedom speech, the beginning of the competition between the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War, and the civil rights movement together. So in my introduction today, I want to talk less about the domestic aspects of the Cold War, which is a huge subject, and it involves the rights of women, the rights of African Americans, the labor movement, and the question of what shape capitalism in the United States is going to take, and within that, where the place is going to be for women, for workers, for African Americans, and so forth. And it is heavily contested, but the Cold War, that competition with the Soviet Union, that notion that communism is the main enemy, regardless of what communists might do and stand for in the countries where they take over, regardless what the people who are our guys, the pro-capitalist, the pro-US people in these countries stand for. This subsumption of all politics, domestic and foreign, under the one goal of defeating the Soviet Union, shapes and colors the domestic politics. It really forms American society. It has an impact on the New Deal coalition and how that is reshaped. Notably, the exclusion of the left from that coalition, the marginalization, not just of communists, but anybody vaguely progressive. And on the right, the rise of a political current, a new kind of conservatism, that for whom even the modest elements of hedging capitalism, of civilizing capitalism, and of making society more equal, sharing power rather than reserving it to white men only, are too much already, and who want to roll back the clock on all that. So this is the soil on which the political spectrum grows that still exists to this day. The Cold War is very much still shaping American politics to this day. Even beyond a generation that was actually alive and politically active during the Cold War. But since we're going to be talking about the domestic side quite a bit, let me say a few words about the foreign politics, the international politics of the Cold War. The defining moment in this war is the Berlin blockade. And in response to that, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is formed. NATO encompasses the United States, Canada, and the Western European countries that are not communist. What the Berlin blockade shows, and I'm going to have you look at this map here. This is a map of post-war Germany. So the parts to the east were chopped off and made part of Poland. They had strong Polish minority populations, and as kind of the territorial punishment for German imperial ambition, had Hitler won the war, the German Empire would have expanded into the east and made slaves of the Slavic populations in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. So this was widely regarded as an adequate territorial punishment for Germany. But the remaining Germany was divided under the four victorious Allied powers. The British occupied the northwest, the Russians occupied the east, the Americans the southeast, and the French the southwest. Within the British sector, in the zone of occupation in the north, there are two dots here in orange that are actually part of the American zone of occupation. This is the city of Bremen and its exterritorial port of Bremerhaven, which the United States used for sea access, for ocean access to resupply its troops. So under the Allied occupation statute, Germany was supposed to be administered jointly by all four Allied powers, by an Allied commission seated in Berlin. Now, in the city of Berlin, incidentally, was likewise divided into four parts. Only here it shows in red the eastern part, which is under Soviet control, and in black the western part, but that is actually also subdivided into three distinct sectors: American, French, and British. But the city of Berlin was administered separately from the rest of the country, and not treated as the capital of Germany because it had such a fraught history. And there was no German state after 1945. And the Soviet Union wanted to force a reunification of Germany under a socialist government. It wanted to avoid that Germany becomes a partner with the US and a potential rearmed threat to the Soviet Union in the next war. And they used their possession of East Germany and their ability to cut Berlin off from access, like West Berlin, from access to the western zones of occupation in 1948, to force the Allies at this point to give all of Berlin to the Soviet Union and to make it part of the Soviet sector of occupation. The Allies, the Western Allies, responded to that by mounting a massive airlift, bringing in supplies to the city of Berlin for many months by plane. Oftentimes, the planes would run at a frequency that you only get with subways in New York, one after the other, continuously for months and months on end. There were many casualties in an operation of that size, but the city of Berlin, the western half of the city of Berlin, remained supplied with the necessities and held strong, so the Soviets didn't get it. And at that point, the Soviet Union abandoned its plan. Instead, they declared the eastern sector of Berlin to be part of a new German Democratic Republic, also known as East Germany, while the Western Allies allowed the three Western zones of occupation to form the Federal Republic of Germany, with its capital city in the west, in the Rhineland, in the city of Bonn, not shown here. But West Berlin remained in basically no man's land under Allied occupation. The people living there were not technically citizens of either East or West Germany, although they had full rights in West Germany if they so wished. But for instance, they were not required to serve in the military once West Germany was rearmed, making it a prime location for anybody who wished to avoid having to serve in the military. Now, after the airlift, the Soviet Union was clearly defined by American foreign policy establishment as a threat, as an enemy that needed to be contained. You couldn't fight them head on because they just had too strong an army. You couldn't do a nuclear first strike on them because they also had nukes. In fact, you couldn't risk direct open warfare between the US and the Soviet Union, in that both sides had enough nukes soon to wipe out the population of the world many times over. But what you could try at least is to stop the spread of the power and influence of the Soviet Union beyond its borders. This was known as the containment strategy. And it not just meant to prop up anti-communist forces in other countries of the world, but it also meant to establish a ring of military bases all the way around the perimeter of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the appeal of communism as the champion of the rights of the oppressed, of the working class, of the victims of colonial imperial powers, the European powers, meant that in many places Soviet influence expanded even after this point. China, notably, Mongolia, Burma, all had communist governments by 1950, and the United States were looking anxiously at Africa. It is colored here in green because these are the places that could tilt either way. And of course, this is immediately linked to civil rights, because in Africa, the leaders of newly independent nations that have been oppressed for some 70 to 80 years by Europeans, where Africans were second-class citizens in their own home, under laws that were based on racial ideology. People who are the leaders of these newly independent African nations are looking to the United States, and they're seeing the Jim Crow South, they're seeing the white supremacy, they see the refusal, they see the crowds of angry white people who stand in front of schoolhouses, spitting and yelling at little children who want to go to school and won't allow them because they're black. So if you're looking for a friend in the international scene, the Soviet Union looks good, because they're sending tractors, they're sending specialists in agriculture and industry, they're sending help for building roads. And in order not to lose influence in the world and avoid the further spread of communism, there is a double strategy the United States follows. Aid of a military kind to anybody who might oppose communists, and then eventually also direct intervention. And here you have another view of the extent of the Soviet Union and its allies on the world. It's actually fairly limited, but it looks so scary because, you know, Russia is a huge country. Nobody lives in these parts, in Siberia. Nevertheless, it is a large and powerful country. And here, just to give you an idea of the arms race, of the nuclear arms race, until eventually in the 1980s, some kind of understanding was reached to limit the nuclear capabilities and eventually to dial back the ability to wipe out the world's population many times over. It just went up and up and up. By the way, the number of warheads is one measure. Another one is, of course, how far can you get them, by what means, and so forth. So it is not quite as uneven as it looks. Besides, what's the point to keep counting once you reach the capability to wipe out the world's population once? That's all you really need, isn't it? So, but the first war where the United States got involved directly on a mission to stop the spread of communism was in Korea. Korea had two competing movements in World War II who were fighting against a Japanese occupation force. One army was pro-communist and the other was nationalist. The communists, after the Japanese left, were in control of North Korea, shown in red, and bordering on China, also shown in red. And the nationalists were in charge of South Korea. Now, the communists in September of 1950 made a push to conquer the South, and they got pretty far, and only a small part of South Korea, which, however, included an important seaport that allowed American troops to come into the country, were conquered. The Southern Korean regime, the nationalist regime, did not have much support among the population. Their strength really were the weapons. They had the backing of old elites that had long exploited the mass of the population, many of whom had collaborated with the Japanese. So their backing was standing on a very small basis. When in the fall of 1950, American troops came in, and this was also with a couple of international troops to help, British, French, Australian, and so forth. By November of 1950, almost the entire country, except for a small stretch in the north, had been retaken. At that point, the government of China, the communist government of China, with an expression of regret, informed the world that 1 million of its citizens, on their own volition and against the wishes of the Chinese government, had taken up arms and apparently accomplished to train themselves professionally as soldiers, had acquired military equipment, and had moved into North Korea to help the brother nation or sister nation of Korea fight against imperialism. So the Chinese were disavowing what they were doing, which is basically to fight against the Americans on that peninsula. With Chinese help, the North was able to take back most of its previous territory, and by July of 1953, the armistice line had been reached. That was and that's where we're still at today. The war never ended. There was an armistice signed, an agreement not to keep fighting, but not a peace treaty. And because under the rules of the United Nations, North Korea was officially in violation of United Nations law. So who went to war against North Korea is technically the rest of the world, the United Nations, and that is that makes things even more complicated. But the Korean War was a traumatic experience. It was a butcher fest. Many millions of Koreans died in this war. American troops both were at the receiving and at the committing end of atrocities. The leadership of the American military at one point tried to nuke Beijing to get a quick end to the war. And when President Truman refused, for a time, certain generals considered overthrowing the democratically elected government of the United States so that they would get to nuke Beijing. These generals were then removed from office, but that also shows how, if you're going to bring your country in line behind a plan of global war on an unlimited scale for a goal that you define as an existential one, might start tainting your own system of government and your own political culture. The more important conflict in terms of shaping American society was that in Vietnam. And the history of the Vietnam War goes back far before United States involvement. Vietnam had been part of French Indochina, which included, as you see here on this map, Laos and Cambodia. These were all French possessions. During World War II, French Indochina was under the occupation of the Japanese, and the Japanese cultivated nationalist, anti-colonial movements. As you might recall, in many of these countries that had been conquered and occupied by Europeans as colonies, there were nationalist resistance movements, independence movements that sympathized on the grounds of their shared nationalism with Japanese and German fascism. So in Vietnam, you had those groups, but the majority of the movement that wanted independence and that opposed colonial rule and that had opposed the Japanese was democratically minded. They looked to the West, they looked to France with its ideals of revolutionary tradition for democracy, equality, and brotherhood as a model. Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of the democratic movement in Vietnam, of the democratic independence movement, traveled to Paris in 1949, fully expecting that he would return with guarantees for Vietnamese independence. But the French, not to mince any words, screwed him over and said, sorry, we changed our mind, you can't be independent. And in fact, they stepped up a military campaign to regain full control of Vietnam. That did not go well. And in 1954, the French had suffered a pretty humiliating defeat. Ho Chi Minh and his side of the independence movement took control of North Vietnam. The nationalist movement that was pro-Western took over South Vietnam. The interesting thing, however, with somebody like Ho Chi Minh, and this is later true also of Fidel Castro of Cuba, these were people who were not initially going into their war of independence thinking, or in the Cuban case, a civil war against a brutal militaristic dictator. They didn't go into these wars thinking we're going to flip this country to the communist side. They were going into it saying we're going to have an independent country that is democratically run. But the United States weren't going to let them do that. They didn't want them as allies, and they backed these militarists, these nationalists instead, because they figured the other side, the democratic side, is not clearly disavowing all association with communists. They might offer communists a platform, whereas the nationalists are clearly committed to fighting communism at all costs and with any means. So for 5 years, as there was a partitioning of Vietnam in effect into North and South Vietnam, the United States supplied the South Vietnamese army with weapons and training and so forth. Until in 1959, the North Vietnamese attacked the South and nearly conquered the entire country. And then the same thing that had happened before in Korea was repeated, although more slowly. American support of the South Vietnamese regime was first covert. A handful of CIA operatives, a couple of military advisors, but eventually, especially after the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident, which gave President Johnson a pretext to actually go to war officially, Americans had not technically been at war in Vietnam, only in fact. So this war ended in defeat for the United States. The reason being that the regime in South Vietnam that the US backed was just that awful. They had no sense of the rights of the people, democracy, and so forth. It was a militarist and kleptocratic regime. The Northern Vietnamese, on the other hand, had the backing of the people, including the bulk of the population in South Vietnam. So with that kind of massive support, you never had clear front lines. You always had guerrilla warfare, and eventually the cost in lives to the American side was staggering. There was a sense that you couldn't really win the war, and there was also a sense that maybe it wasn't a just war to fight to begin with, because after all, who were these people who you were backing, and what gave the US the right to say, we determine who governs Vietnam. So with all that taken together, eventually Richard Nixon in 1975 made peace with the Vietnamese. But this war keeps defining American political identities. There is a sense that it almost functions like World War I did in Germany. The idea that the hippies, the peace movement, stabbed the soldiers in the back. On the home front, they didn't support the armed forces. They were asking for peace. They didn't give the army a chance to win the war. If it hadn't been for the peace movement, if it hadn't been for the traitors at home, the war could have been won. That is a view that has little to do with reality on the ground. It's a powerful myth, nonetheless. And it has led to some interesting episodes, even up until the last decade. You might remember John Kerry, who was a Democratic presidential candidate in 2004. John Kerry was a rich kid from Boston. He didn't need to serve in the war. And in fact, most people like him got deferments, avoided the draft. John Kerry volunteered to serve in the Navy, served on a speedboat, one of these boats that went up the rivers into the jungle, into enemy territory to supply troops, to support troops, and also to get them out. He was wounded when the boat he commanded came under fire in an ambush. And he turned the boat around to pick up a sailor who had fallen off the boat, rescued that man, saved his life by steering his boat back into that ambush and made it out. And when he returned home, and once he was fixed up again, and you know, his life had been saved, he received the Purple Heart, a medal given to recognize valor when facing the enemy. There was an organized campaign during the 2004 presidential campaign to smear John Kerry by saying this didn't happen. The Republican National Convention that nominated George W. Bush that year, the delegates, many delegates, were wearing Band-Aids on their faces that had little purple hearts painted on them to mock John Kerry and to send a signal to delegitimize the medal he received. Why? Because after John Kerry returned to the United States, he went to Congress in full Navy uniform, decorated Purple Heart soldier, and testified before a committee and talked about what he had seen in Vietnam, about the war crimes, about the atrocities committed by American troops. He questioned the wisdom of continuing to fight this war. And there are some people who just never forgave him for that, to the point where commitment to the myth of what the war was about, that it was a good fight, that Americans were fighting clean and fair, was more important than the truth, more important than the actual heroism of somebody like Kerry. So you couldn't have an actual hero talk truth about this war. That was too much to bear. So you had to deny him recognition that what he did actually happened. Of course, also interesting about this 2004 presidential election campaign is the fact that George W. Bush was, of course, one of the rich kids from the East Coast who got a deferment so that they didn't have to get into the war. And he had a cushy position in the Texas Air National Guard, where apparently he rarely showed up. But of course, George W. Bush was presented to the public as a cowboy from Texas, as an anti-establishment guy. never mind the fact that that Bush and John Kerry actually were in the same class together in Yale, and that the Bush family compound in Kennebunkport in Maine is as East Coast elite as it gets, and that he moved to Texas more or less to reinvent himself as a man of the people. But Kerry and Bush had been members of the same elite exclusive fraternity, the Skull and Bones at Yale. Anywho, so, but how you talk about the Vietnam War, what you think it was about, has been a defining point for where people line up politically, for what people want the United States to look like, whether you acknowledge that it might have been a mistake, that it wasn't fought properly under international law, under the rules of warfare, or whether you insist that this was a good war for a good cause and that it was lost only because bleeding heart liberals and hippies stabbed you in the back and didn't support you. That more or less in a certain generation that defines where people fall politically. So this is one example of how the Cold War has had an enduring effect on American politics. So that's it for my introductory remarks. I've probably dwelt too much on some details, but I'm sure you get the picture. So I'm looking forward to having this week's class discussions.